Okay, hello everyone. This is Cyber Defense Countermeasures Cohort, brought to you by myself, Keanu Crouch, lead instructor for the course. So tonight we will be going over lesson 6, which is performing vulnerability analysis. During this lesson, we're going to review security content automation protocol, explore the common vulnerability scoring system, understand vulnerability validation concepts, and then finally understand important contextual considerations. So just to give it a little bit of background, in the last lesson, we kind of learned about why vulnerability analysis and vulnerability assessments are done in organizations. And in this lesson, we're talking about how the information is actually shared or how information is actually read by other organizations or other professionals so they can actually understand what is being reported within the result, the CVSS score, which is a very important one, and be able to essentially take that information and provide actions based off of the results of the vulnerability assessment conclusion. So with that, we'll go ahead and begin. So we're going to start with topic 6A, understanding vulnerability scoring concepts. So one of the most famous ones is going to be the CVSS score. So we're going to talk about a few of the different applications or iterations, but CVSS score will be the highlight of the vulnerability scoring concepts. Um, I normally don't play the videos. Please, in your free time, if you would like to see what the videos say, please click on that. So with that, I'll go to the next one. All right. So security content automation protocol. So this is a suite of interoperable specifications designed to standardize the formatting and naming conventions used to identify and report on the presence of software flaws, such as misconfigurations and or vulnerabilities. Essentially, look at it from a perspective of how do other systems, how do other organizations, how do other professionals understand what you're trying to say or what you as a compliance manager or a security professional trying to say out of the results of a vulnerability scan. So these are things that will be put into reports. These are things that can be fed into systems. So everyone is kind of on the same page for what for when you're reporting your vulnerability assessments. So the different SCAP languages that are most common out in the field are the Open Vulnerability and Assessment language. This helps describe three main aspects of evaluated system, including system information, machine state, and reporting. So essentially, that is kind of a background of the system, a fingerprint per se, the state of the machine, um, kind of what operating state it's in, and how this information is going to be reported. So as I said, as far as a common language across, a lot of these are going to probably have the same verbiage when it says provides a consistent and interoperable way to collect and assess information regardless of security tools being used. So one of the reasons why using SCAP is important is it prevents a lot of proprietary tools from being able to understand each other. Once you have a common protocol, a common language to spread this information across and to implement this information, we'll be able to better use it and protect our networks. Another we have is the asset reporting format. It helps correlate reporting formats to assess information independently from any specific application or vendor. So just like the oval ARF, actually, it's just another way to ensure that there is there isn't any proprietary tool that cannot understand certain outputs of vulnerability assessments, and that users across the board, no matter kind of which tool is being used, um, is saying what. So then we finally have the extensible configuration checklist description format. This is written in XML. This provides a consistent and standardized way to define benchmark information, as well as configuration security checks to be performed during an assessment. So essentially, all of these SCAP languages have the same intent, is to make a common language for reporting vulnerability assessment results that can be understood by different tools. So the SCAP identification schemes. So the common platform enumeration uses a similar Syntax to Uniform Resource Identifiers, URIs. It's a standardized naming format used to identify systems and software, common vulnerabilities and exposures. You're going to see this a lot in the field. You're going to see it all over the place. CVE is kind of the status quo across the board. So list of workers where each item contains a unique identifier to use to describe publicly known vulnerabilities. So if you're using tools such as Nessus, the government uses ACAS, which is just a flavor of Nessus, OpenVAS, which is just the open source version of what Nessus is. When it identifies a glaring vulnerability, it will put it out as a CVE. You can then take the CVE, and then you can just go on to the website and where all of these are housed, and you can simply search for it and it'll give you more information. It can give you how to actually mitigate it if there's a mitigating control in place, or it can also tell you in some ways how bad the impact will be if that vulnerability is exploited. So then we also have the common configuration enumeration, similar to CV, except focused on configuration issues which may result in a vulnerability. There are, I won't say some situations, there are a lot of situations where an organization will have a tool that is patched or have a service that is patched, the service is updated, and the process of implementing the service results in the service being vulnerable based off of just purely improper configuration. So identifying these configurations and how to best prevent the vulnerabilities will be common configuration enumerations, identification schemes. So here's the first introduction. We have the common vulnerability scoring system calculator. So essentially, if we look at how the scores are computed, they're computed in sequence. The base score is used to calculate the temporal score, and the temporal score is used to calculate the environmental score. We're going to see a graphic about this later to kind of give more of a background on how this looks as far as how they feed into each other. But essentially, there are different exploitability metrics. All of those different exploitability metrics are used to identify what the actual score will be based off of um, how those metrics are applied in the environment, if the system's vulnerable to certain things, if it's an exploitable system, privilege is required to do the actual exploit, the complexity of the attack, um, if there's user interaction involved, such as the user clicking on something, things of that nature. That's how the base score metrics, and we're going to have those broken out. So in order to kind of get more information about this with Insert Master, there are additional links that you can do more research. One that I want to bring to your attention is actually on the next slide. So the common vulnerability scoring system. So it's an industry standard method for assessing the severity of software vulnerabilities. So when it says industry standard, that's really important. This is something that kind of should be known and understood by everyone that is actually conducting vulnerability scans, even cybersecurity analysts that may be reviewing vulnerability scans. When some type of report comes out that says your system or network may be vulnerable to something, then you can look at the CVSS score to see more information about what it is and to actually see if it actually applies to your specific environment. It could be just an incorrect analysis based off of a finding that can almost be taken with a grain of salt, but definitely more investigation has to be conducted to make that determination. So in order to calculate the CVSS score, so CVSS scores can be um, quite subjective based off of the team or the members that are actually creating the overall, um, I guess you could say, scoring model, because the scores are assigned based on impact. So it's not something that's standardized across the community as far as assigning a score based off of the impact to the organization. And it has to change. It has to change because organizations are different. They have different priorities and they have different business operations. And those are taken in consideration when determining the specific score based on the impact. So the process that they would go through in order to do this, would they would first identify the threat agent. Most common threat agents used in CVSS scoring metrics are unauthenticated, authenticated, and remote authenticated users. So you think about where they're actually coming from, inside the network, outside the network, or from somewhere else, like just completely just not even on the same plane of the organizations that are being attacked. So authenticated users can still be within the organization. They can still be physically within the organization, but they just don't have the access required in order to do a certain attack. Then you identify the affected system. This includes identifying the product name and the type of system involved. So that this talks about the service. This might talk about the operating system. This might talk about the type of server being attacked or kind of the scores being written off of. You would then use this information to assign the score. Then you have to take that information, you have to identify the probability of the threat agent accessing the system. So, is there a chance that this actually could be done? And when we talk about air gap system, things of that nature, that can actually change based off of what is the actual reality of whether or not this system can be attacked. Finally, you calculate the overall CVSS score using the information found above. The score will vary depending on the scoring metrics identified in the previous steps. And this is why I said it could be subjective, and it's based off the business operations and the goals of the actual business. And this is the link. No, I don't want to do that. This is the link that I would like you all to visit when you get a chance. Um, so essentially, this allows you to kind of just play around and actually see how the actual scores are applied based off of what is actually what metrics you're actually looking at. So if you hover over, you'll notice that it actually explains what each metric actually means, so you have a better idea of whether that applies, and you can actually kind of build out a score. But each one, if you notice, is like an unknown report confidence. So these reports of impacts that indicate a vulnerability is present. So this can kind of be used as your dictionary, your definition guide when you're creating your when you're assigning your scores to different services, different operating systems, different things of that nature on the network. So this is something that's going to be very important that you're going to use, and you can also play around with it just so you can get kind of more information. We're going to go over some of these metrics. You can kind of get an idea of the overarching understanding of what they mean and how you can best apply it. So CVS vector strings, a piece of additional information provided alongside a CVSS score to provide more context around the scoring metrics used to calculate the overall CVSS score. So this is very important. This gives you background as to how the organization or the team that created the CVSS scoring model were able to come to that conclusion based off of information within the organization. This is what you need with the CVSS score to kind of understand why certain things were scored what they scored. So the benefits of CVSS. So the CVSS provides an objective measure of the risk posed by a given vulnerability, allowing IT teams to prioritize remediation efforts and allocate resources more effectively. So with CVSS scores, you're able to kind of see a high level approach or a high level picture of what vulnerabilities are present in your organization. You can use this to make a priority listing. This can be brought to meetings, this can be brought to stakeholders. And what essentially happens is this can feed into what will actually get organizational attention. This may be money, or this may be resources, people, assets. This will help the stakeholders decide what they want to protect or what they want to protect or what they want to put a lot of their emphasis on in order to better protect their network. So I have a really good question actually. For the exam, will CVSS version 3.1 be in play, or does the exam stick with version 3.0? So I will say go with version 3.0 because that is what is most understood in the field. But 3.1, since it is coming down the pipeline, I would make sure that you kind of peruse it, understand kind of any of the changes between the two to make sure that even if you are to get a question, you can have a better understanding of it. The changes that will come down based off of a question that they may ask you will not be discerned between 3.1 and 3.0. We'll be talking about the overall concept. It's not really kind of a gotcha type of idea. It's kind of just more of if do you understand CVSS and how it's actually applied? So the challenge of CVSS is it does not provide more information about the exploitability of the vulnerability. It's like, is this an exploitable vulnerability that has been identified? So they might remediate a bunch of vulnerabilities, or they might remediate something that is not even exploitable. They might have a vulnerability that lies on an air gap server. Like this server has no external connections. It does have to be put onto the overall list of vulnerabilities because it is present. And when you're doing your scans, if it is an asset within your organization, there's something that you want to pay attention to, but it may not be exploitable. So you may put a lot of resources and money and time and effort into mitigating a vulnerability that has no chance of being exploited because of the environmental factors that we'll talk about a little bit later. The environmental factors that actually are around this piece of equipment or this asset, and then you may miss your mark and not be able to put that same effort and time into something that does actually connect the network that is exploitable. And at that point, you're kind of working backwards because you're not actually protecting your network from a realistic threat. At that point, you're just kind of using the CVSS as a checklist. We don't really want to use it as a checklist. We want to apply our specific business operations and business goals, pair that with CVSS scores to identify the priorities, how we want to attack the response actions. So these are the CVSS tools that are most often used in the field. Nessus, so it's the widely used vulnerability assessment tool to identify system vulnerabilities. So if you ever work in the DoD, essentially all ACAS is what the tool is for a lot of vulnerability scanning. It is the DoD's version of Nessus. And if you look at OpenVAS, it is the open source version of Nessus. So Nessus is kind of the industry standard. OpenSCAB is an open source scanner to identify system vulnerabilities, and it can provide the ability to calculate the CVSS score based on the vulnerabilities identified in the system. Qualys is another widely used vulnerability assessment tool. So this is a paid tool. It just depends on what organization you go to and what tool they've decided to implement based on their business goals. And the security scorecard, it's a cloud-based solution that enables organizations to assess and improve their security posture. That is one of the main selling factors of security scorecard. Is if it's already tailored to the cloud, so it makes it so organizations don't have to buy a license for something like Qualys and then tailor that to their cloud assets, something that's already out in the cloud, and the developers already have experience with cloud technologies. So, so the CVSS metrics generate a score from 0 to 10 based on intrinsic characteristics of their vulnerability, the base, the environment in which the exposure occurs, and the changing characteristics of the vulnerability over time, temporal. These scores can be banded into descriptions as well. So instead of using this generic none, low, medium, high, critical, based off of your organizational goals and off of how your security team wants to approach this, we can maybe put more of a definition into the description of how serious the vulnerability is based off of the score. They might not use critical, they might use emerging, or they might instead of none, they might say like info, something like that. It just depends on the organizational processes and how they wish to implement it. But this is the standard that it is based off of. So understanding this will help you apply it when you see it out in the field and it's something different from what you've learned. So this is the important part. The base metrics group identified as of version 3.1 is what we're actually looking at right now. But the base metrics are what is really most important. This is where you start, is when you're identifying if the vulnerability is something that you want to take serious. So your base metrics, the possible values of physical, local, adjacent network, or network. So physical may be putting in a USB, local means maybe within your organization, within your building. Adjacent network, it's a very important one because these describe your trust relationships. So if you have an adjacent network that you have in place in order to make business easier, or APIs are in between them, a lot of organizations forget about this. This is a CVSS score object. This is something that's very important because one way to get into organizations is a lot of times through maybe a sister organization that does not have the same security controls in place. So attack complexity. So it refers to the difficulty of the attack techniques used by the threat actor. So we look at attack complexities. You're comparing, if you hear the slang term used, script kiddie versus an APT. So script kiddies may just do a low, straightforward attack, something that's just like an easy kill, where you might have a threat actor that has a lot more of a budget, a lot of resources available to them, and they're able to construct a, a really complex, strong campaign against an organization. So risk will be higher based off of the complexity of the attack that can occur. Privilege is required. This is just straightforward. Standard user, administrator, or guest user. So what are the privileges required in order to conduct this attack? User interaction. This is important because if we think of how some attacks are done, one very common attack is spear phishing. Spear phishing requires user interaction. A user opened this email up, a user clicked something. Is this attack prone to user interaction for it to occur? If it's something that is based off of logic, that's background, and users do not interact with this specific system or this specific logic that poses the vulnerability, poses the risk, then the user interaction will be none. But if this is something that may come in off of a deprecated version of Outlook where a user has to click something in order for this to occur, then then the user interaction would be required. Scope. This indicates whether the exploit affects only the local security context or not. For example, a hypervisor vulnerability might allow an exploit for one VM to other VMs. So this is called VM escape. So is the scope of this vulnerability something that attacks just this one specific service or specific system, or is this something that attacks that can have the ability to attack multiple across the board? So we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad. Where the metrics above assess exploitability. These three separate metrics impacts to the CIA triad. So whether any of the specific CIA triad objectives are attacked based off of the specific any of the CIA triad subjects can be exploited based off of the specific threat. And the CIA triad would definitely apply when we're talking about the goals of the organization, because organizations might not care about confidentiality. They might not care about integrity or availability. Depends on what their actual goals are and what their compliance requirements are. So these metrics are used in the CVSS security and metrics description. Notice that the vector is a string comprised of the base metrics detailed in the above chart. So this is the vector that they're talking about. This is that string that when we see it on a test, we kind of don't know what it's talking about. It's gibberish. But if we go back to our base metrics and then we look back at our string, so when it says attack vector, AV, it's a network attack vector. AC is attack complexity. It's high. All right, so we have a question on the base metrics. If you could just put it in the chat and then I can go over it. Look at the privilege required. That will be none. So essentially, if you just read these, if you kind of just understand the base metrics, you can actually see which metric and what level it applies to that specific attack. So we're going to roll into topic 6B, exploring vulnerability context considerations. So vulnerability scans, they check for open ports, protocol compliance, misconfigured firewalls or routers, unpatched softwares, cross-site scripting problems, SQL injection weaknesses, and many other issues. Vulnerability scans, they have uncredentialed and credentialed scans that we learned in lesson 5, where essentially they are designed to crawl across the network. They have scripts, they poke and prod across the network, and they essentially try to see if there are characteristics of certain services, certain systems on the network that identify the risk of a potential exploit. So they identify a vulnerability and they help assign a score based off of whether that vulnerability can be exploited based on the ease. They assist with this. So you're not going to be able to, if you have an enterprise of 10,000 hosts, it is going to be quite um, a task to go through each one of the systems and poke and prod these holes with your own scripts and try to just pen test each specific box. That's what we have vulnerability scans for. So we have validating vulnerabilities. So I have a question. So on attack complexity, reading through, it says the skill of the attacker, but at the same time it says the level of difficulty when getting to the system. So yes, so you may have a very robust system, but when we think of if an attack is, if you have a very robust, very secure system, it most likely will need to be a quite complex attack in order to attack that system. Generally, script kiddies are not getting into very robust security structures. Like script kiddies are generally not getting into hacking into Google or hacking into Sony. Those organizations have resources that are attacking these, and they're very complex attacks as to how they did it, and so that increases the attack complexity in order to do it, whereas maybe a standard user might be able to be attacked by a script kiddie because their security posture is not as robust as a larger organization. So it would need to be a lower attack complexity. So back to vulnerability scans. So the scan targets can be individual systems, a subnet or a logical grouping of assets such as database, web application servers, or perhaps industrial control systems. So I want you to remember that generally when you're doing these vulnerability scans, you want to make sure that the vulnerability scan is tailored to the environment that you're scanning. I like that it brought up industrial control systems and then it says web or application servers. Industrial control systems, they will generally have a lot of criticals when it comes to attacks. They're generally very old and they kind of just run and they're so expensive to replace that a lot of patches don't get put on because they don't want to break something, or maybe the patch is not even available where something is just a regular web server that's out facing the internet. It might be very secure, very prone. It might not be prone to actual attack because we don't want to just keep getting our web server attacked from the forward facing internet. So we're going to put a lot of controls and we have the ability to. So you want to make sure that you are tailoring to that environment. So if you know this, you want to make sure that you're not scanning your Windows 95 run ICS SCADA system with a scan that is designed for the newest version of Apache, because you will get a lot of errors, you will get a lot of criticals. You're almost kind of confusing the vulnerability scanner because you will get a lot of kickback from it. What you want to do is you want to make sure that if you're scanning something that you know is prone to a lot of um, vulnerabilities and you're already aware of a lot of them, you want to use a scan that may be something new that is still relevant to that specific server or service or system. So that can assist you with ensuring that you are not kind of tainting your results, because if you are not doing this properly, your results are going to be all over the place. You're going to have answers on your vulnerability scanner that is just making you think that your network is super insecure, but you may already have controls in place and you didn't even ensure that you are tailoring your scans based off of the controls that you already have in place to see if there's something else that you are not covering. So validating vulnerabilities. This based off of the way we want to scan and tailor our scans to the specific environment that we're scanning, we want to make sure that we validate the vulnerabilities. We want to make sure we're scanning properly, and we want to make sure the vulnerabilities actually do exist and it's not just an error on the base of the scanner or the operator conducting the scanner. So for example, the report may identify vulnerable software, but closer inspection may reveal the software is not present on the endpoint specified. So it might come out and say, basically, let's say you do an uncredentialed scan and it says this version of this web server is vulnerable on this port, and you're like, I'm not even running that. I'm running a whole different service on that. The scanner may have been improperly configured, or it may have just read the results of when it poked the system without, because it didn't have credentials, may have just read the results and interpreted those incorrectly and give you an output that doesn't apply to your system. So you want to validate that that vulnerability actually exists based off of conducting further investigation of the results of your scan. So security analysts must review vulnerability scan reports carefully to confirm or refute the findings. Ideally, the vulnerability scan provides detailed information regarding all vulnerabilities in the scan systems and devices. So if we take that report and we just say everything this thing says is true, I know what I'm doing. I don't really make a whole lot of mistakes, and I know how to configure it. And we have 3,000 criticals, and we take that up to our boss, and our boss is like, "How do we have 3,000 criticals all of a sudden?" But you never did any investigation. Then essentially you're giving reporting improper information that may be able to lead to bad decisions made on a higher level just because you just didn't do further investigation and validate those specific vulnerabilities. So when we talk about the results of vulnerability scans, we have kind of four conundrums that we can run into, four challenges: false positives, true positive, false negative, true negative. So if we just break them down to kind of a more simplistic mindset, false positive essentially is saying something is there, a vulnerability exists, and vulnerability is not there. You do further investigation, and that's where we go back. It's like we're not even running that specific service that this thing is says or that I'm vulnerable to. I'm not even running that. That's a false positive. True positive is when it says something is vulnerable. We go and do further investigation, and it truly is vulnerable. We truly identify that yes, this is vulnerable. This is the right service that it says I'm running. This is the right version that it says I'm running, and this is a real vulnerability. False negative is when it identifies that a vulnerability does not exist, but the vulnerability does exist. This is kind of one of the scarier ones because essentially at the end of your scan, unless you have more background unless you know something is there and you want to test your scanner to see if it identifies it, you don't know that it's a false negative until something occurs. Maybe something may come out. You might do more investigation to saying, "Hey, I have this web server. It's running this version, so I know for a fact I'm vulnerable to this, but the scanner did not tell me this." That can be very scary when it comes to vulnerability scans in general, but it's kind of the world we live in. Not everything is going to be perfect. This is why we kind of conduct further investigations. We not only conduct vulnerability scans from an automated perspective, we're also checking our service versions, our patch levels. We're actually doing the actual work that vulnerability scanning is doing to validate that the vulnerability scanner is actually doing its job. And if it's not doing its job, it's not that it's improperly written. It might just have a blind spot, and but we can still make a score based off of the results that we can do when we do our manual work. Then a true negative is when it says your system is secure, there's nothing there, and there truly is nothing there. It's essentially that's a good day for a compliance manager. So that's not ever going to be the actual case that I've seen in the field. If you run a vulnerability scan and you don't even have as much as a info, then either your scan was configured or maybe you were just super locked down, but generally you're going to have at least an info if your system actually talks, if your system actually talks out on the network. Like you're going to be vulnerable to something. It's just the mitigating factors that you put in front of that in order to compensate for that vulnerability. So exploring CVSS scoring consideration. So this is where we talk about what mitigating factors are available. Then we also talk about what how serious is this result from this vulnerability scan? How actually true is this vulnerability score that was put out based off of the results of the scan? Some of the most of the common ones are availability of the patches. So if you identify a vulnerability and there is a patch available, you just happen to patch your system. Let's say patch Tuesdays with Microsoft, but your organization does the patch till Thursday. You conduct a scan on Wednesday. You know the patch is available. It's just not there yet. You can kind of almost mark that off like that will be patched tomorrow. Impact of the vulnerability. What will happen if an attacker exploits this vulnerability? Am I just going to lose a server that's just kind of there? I don't really use it. It really shouldn't be on. Or am I going to actually lose my whole network? Or is my business going to stop? So you start assigning value to assets, high value assets or assets that your organization needs to run. And then your supporting assets. Low value assets may just be a host that's just on the network, like just a regular workstation that doesn't really it can you can unplug it from the wall and nothing bad will happen. That'll be considered a low value asset. So level of sophistication of threat actors, this goes back to the attack complexity. So the likelihood that an attacker can successfully exploit a vulnerability, that matters a lot because if there is some type of vulnerability where it's like, yes, if an attacker had a quantum computer, they could definitely exploit this within 3 years. But if at that point, a script kiddie wouldn't even be something that's on your radar because it's something that only complex threat actors would try to approach. And then that's when you kind of look at your threats to see if someone actually would want to exploit that based off your business model. But then we go into threat intelligence, things of that nature. Asset value, then asset value and the impact of vulnerability are kind of related. So the asset value is what is assigned asset value based off of your business operations and the business goals. Weaponization, and it says the likelihood that an attacker will be able to weaponize a vulnerability to achieve their objectives. Maybe they need to conduct like so much research in order to conduct the right development and create the perfect tool that'll do it. That it's like the likeliness of this weaponization occurring and them actually creating something and using it against us, it would take years because there may be so many controls and so many factors that go into it that the chances of a tool actually being made to do it are very low. And this is why it's very important that when threat intel shares new attacks out in the field, new weapons, new cyber tools, it's so important to pass information along because tools are reused so much. Like if a new piece of malware comes out in India, we want to know about that in America. We want to know about that in Canada because if we're not aware of it, if that information is siloed, essentially an attacker can basically say, like, okay, I've attacked this over here, or let me scan over here to see what else is vulnerable to it. If I'm not aware of that, they can use the same tool and get kind of more bang for their buck. And then exploitability. So exploitability is kind of we get back to how realistic it is for the actual attack to occur. Availability of tools and techniques to exploit it, where the actual system sits, what mitigating factors are in front of it. Like, what could this actually happen? Do we already have so many security measures in place to defend this that it's really a very low factor. It's not something that's really on our radar. It's like yes, I do know that port is open on that system that sits behind 17 safe doors and 14 armed guards, and it doesn't connect to anything. Yes, it does have an open port that's vulnerable, but what are the chances of someone being able to plug into this thing and then connect and then scan it and then exploit a vulnerability? So a 0 day represents an exploitable vulnerability with no available patch. 0 days are a big deal in the field. When they come up, generally a lot of security researchers, security engineers, um, uh, companies like Mandiant, Alexity, a lot of these organizations, they hone in on the 0 days. Because if you have an exploitable vulnerability on your network and there is no patch, it's basically like you leaving your front door open and going to work. And you know it's open and you haven't bought a lock yet. There's nothing you can really do. You can put things in front of it, but then you also have to weigh the risk of, are these controls that I'm putting in front of this going to hinder my profit in my organization? Those are the type of things you have to think about when it comes to 0 days. So using this information, you can make vulnerability score adjustments based off of those different factors and how they actually apply to your network. So another example might include a vulnerability marked as informational and not designated with the CVSS score. Those are what I was telling you about. If you conduct a vulnerability scan and you don't see something as simple as just informational, then I'm assuming that your vulnerability scan may be configured improperly because you'll get those most of the time. You'll get at least one. Um, may want to look at those informational ones just because vulnerability scanners are not perfect. You might get an informational and then you realize that the vulnerability scan interpreted an open port or a vulnerable service different than what it actually was. And this thing is actually a gaping hole that can be taken advantage of. It may not be critical based off of what the scanner said, but after you do your further investigation as a cybersecurity analyst, you identify that that is something that is very critical to the organization. And you may like escalate that to a critical in order so you can get attention to it, resources, and you can actually have time to kind of close that gap. So CVS score calculations, they're very difficult. It's something that it's not really fun, but it's something that's necessary in order to prioritize and better secure your network. It's kind of our first line of defense. I know when I used to work on teams within the DoD, first thing that you do is a vulnerability scan. That's the first thing you always want to do, is to see kind of what's there, what holes are there, so I'm aware of these before I actually do further investigation. Those CVSS scores can help highlight, at least they'll get you on the right track of what things you should be looking at as far as how an adversary may have entered the network or how an adversary may have taken advantage of something. So they're important, but they're very difficult to do once you're starting out. But once you do them more, you'll get a better idea of how to apply certain factors and assign certain scores. So you kind of just be able to do it kind of more autonomously. Please understand that this is not kind of like a side duty of a cybersecurity analyst in most organizations. In most organizations, this is someone's sole job is to do this. This is not something like where you have to monitor your dashboards and implement these security fixes and configure the switch. And like, oh, you also got to calculate CVSS scores. This is generally something that's done by someone whose sole job is to conduct vulnerability scans, someone who has that business acumen as well as that cybersecurity knowledge, and they can marry those two together, and that is their sole function. So the categories, we have impact, exploitability, and remediation. So remediation is the cost and effort required to fix our vulnerability. Exploitability, like we talked about before, is the ease and likelihood of exploiting that specific vulnerability. The impact is the potential damage or the harm caused by the vulnerability. And there's just kind of a brief idea of the metrics. And here we're going to get into how the calculation is done on a sequential from base, temporal to environment. So we have our base metrics. These are the ones that we kind of talk about from the basic level attack vector, how they're getting in, the attack complexity, the level of knowledge and experience that the attacker must have, and how easy it will be to exploit it if it was required. These are things that we talked about in the beginning. Then these things turn into temporal metric groups, which allow us to kind of understand if is the exploit code something that is very tried and true within the field, within the red team field, something that has been fixed, it's been patched, because exploits do get patched. Exploits do get like attacks do get fixed out in the wild as like updates and patches, just like regular services. Someone might put a piece of malware out there, and then people identify an error, an issue with it, or they can make it stronger, or they can make it do more things, and they will update that exploit code to make it kind of more robust and actually conduct more, cause more damage. Remediation level, what things have you put in place? And then the report confidence, kind of, is this information that we see, is it actually true? Have we actually done our investigation? Have we vetted it? Have we validated the actual results? And we're using this with the base metrics, and then we move into the environmental metrics group. That's why it turns into the modified base metric. So we've applied the temporal metric group to the base metric group to create the environmental metric group. So then that's why our CIA triad is in the environmental metric group. So think of your environmental metric group as your business operations and what is important to them. And this is how you're going to create your scoring. So you have your base. This is just the standard. This is what you start with. Your temporal, when you kind of add some of those different complexities, so some of those different variables into your base metrics, and then apply it into your business operations to have an end goal, have an understanding of how to best calculate a score that you can use to protect your organization. It's just a summary. So some of the things we went over: automated tools, CVSS scores. One of the really important things is the vectors, those lines that we look at and we just don't know what they mean. Just remember, each of those sections is a base metric, and then so it'll have the base metric with a colon, and then with the letter at the end of that, and that letter applies to what value that base metric is assigned. And then another very important thing is kind of that flow of going from our base metrics, using that information to create our temporal metrics that are pulled from I won't say the environment, but that are pulled from kind of what is the current situation. As far as what remediation we have, we kind of expound on those base metrics and kind of make those apply. And then we use all of this information to apply it into our environmental metric, which we apply our actual business operations in and what's important and what priorities we assign to that information.